My name is Monica, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to transition from software engineering to product management. We are going to cover a lot today, but as a quick overview, first I'll start with a quick background on myself. I'll talk you through how I personally transitioned to product management, the thought process that I went through, and I'll briefly touch on how I made that transition. Second, I'll talk about understanding the PM job. We'll go over what's required to be a good PM and how to determine if this is the right job for you. Third, and I think this is the most important section, we'll cover how you can prepare for the PM interview. I'll go over the types of PM questions that you might get in an interview and how you can think through how to answer them. Lastly, I'll also talk about how you can become a great PM after making it through the interviews and getting a role. So let's get started. I'll start with a little bit about myself. I studied computer science at Cornell University. And I actually get this question a lot. Everyone asks me, "Oh, were you really interested in coding and computer science from like middle and high school? And was it something you were always passionate about?" And honestly, the answer is no. I was pre-med when I first went to college. Computer science wasn't even something that I was interested in. But after 2 years of being pre-med, I was reevaluating if I really wanted to be a doctor. And I had taken a computer science class as part of an engineering requirement at Cornell. And I knew that I enjoyed it. So I thought I would see if computer science was the right fit for me. And for me personally, it worked out great. I really enjoyed the coding classes that I took, and I decided to commit to computer science as a major. And I'm still super happy with that choice. And I think it made a big impact in how I think about technology and my future career path. After college, I started as a software engineer at Google. I was a SWE for 4 years. And first, I spent 2 years working on the Google payments team. Payments at Google is split up into two parts. There's the consumer side, which is the team that builds the Google Pay app. But there's also a payments platform, and this is the team that processes taxes and invoices all of the money that's paid to Google, whether that's through ads revenue or through a YouTube Red subscription or any other time a consumer pays money to Google. I did that for 2 years, but it was a really back end job, and I felt like I wanted to work on something more user facing. I switched gears and I switched to the search team for emerging markets. The team's mission at the time, and it still exists, is to grow Google search usage in emerging markets. And at the time, the team was really small. There was just four of us. And we theorized that the reason people weren't searching enough was because the search results page wasn't delivered in a friendly way for them. If you're not an English speaker or you're not familiar with English, seeing a big page with lots of blue links is really not the most friendly way for you to get your information. So we started building one boxes, which are those cards that appear on the search results page, specifically containing information that we felt was useful for users in emerging markets, but perhaps wasn't a strong use case for people in the US. So two examples are we built an internet speed test, and I believe that feature is still live. If you Google internet speed test, you can actually test your internet speed in the browser instead of going to a third-party website like Ookla. And the other one box we built was for lottery results. Lottery is really popular in several countries that we were targeting, but it wasn't as strong of a use case in the United States, which is why no one had ever attempted to build it. But we built a one box that would show you your lottery results in almost real time, and that also was received really well by users. But at this point, it had been about 4 years since I had graduated from college and started working as a software engineer. And I was reevaluating where I wanted to take my career next. There were a lot of things that I really liked about being a software engineer. I like the fact that you can build something yourself and it ultimately gets into the hands of a user where they can actually, use it, play with it, poke around in your feature. And at Google, the impact is really incredible. Hundreds of thousands, even millions of people use the features that we build. And while I found that really satisfying, I did feel like there were a lot of other parts of the product development process that wasn't really part of my role as a software engineer. That includes brainstorming different ideas for features that we can build, building out mocks for the features with our UX designers. It included working with marketing to sell our features to users, and even future roadmap planning, and reassessing and reevaluating that roadmap based on performance of the product and other user feedback. So after thinking about all this, I decided that I wanted to try product management. And at Google, there's a program where you can rotate into a product management role. It's kind of like an internship where you try out the role for 6 months. If you don't like it, you can go back to your old job. But if you do like it, you can attempt to go through product management interviews, the same interviews that an external candidate would go through. And if you do well in your rotation, and of course you do well in your interviews, you can actually officially change roles. So that's what I did. I spent my rotation working on a product called Google Station. It's a free Wi-Fi service for emerging markets. We would partner with like a Time Warner or a Comcast in several other countries and launch free public Wi-Fi hotspots at places like train stations, hence the name Google Station, or shopping malls. Basically places where there's lots of foot traffic and also lots of downtime. So people wanted to get online and browse the internet without using a lot of their own mobile data. I was the new country launch PM for Google Station, and it was a really fun experience. We launched in 5 new countries the year I was the PM. And I think I spent maybe 6 months on the road traveling. And more importantly, though, it was really exciting to learn about a completely different type of product. I had only worked on payments and sort of like front-end user-facing features, but this was a hardware product and it involved working in emerging markets, so it was a whole different challenge. I did that for a year, but after a year, I decided that I was ready for a change, and I moved to Singapore to work on Google Pay. And on Google Pay, I was responsible for new country launches. So we launched Google Pay in Singapore and are looking forward towards a whole other suite of launches coming up. We just launched in the US, a revamped version of the app a couple of weeks ago. So I've been doing that for 2 years. I just moved back to the Bay Area. But as I look back on my career and the path that I've taken, for me, switching to product management was definitely the right call. The job is definitely not all what I expected, but I personally find it really fulfilling. And for me, it's a much better fit than software engineering. So I hope after hearing the rest of this talk today, you'll also be equipped with not just the tools to decide if this is the right job for you, but also some tips on how you can make it past the interviews and start studying. So with that, let's move on to the next section, understanding the PM job. I pulled this description from Google's careers website, careers.google.com. And when I first read it, I thought it was a bit wordy, but after reading it again, I think this is a pretty accurate description of all the different parts of a PM's role. So let's break this down. Architect the future of our products by bridging engineering and business as you manage a product's lifecycle from strategic planning to development and launch. So this first part here, architecting the future of our products. To me, this really speaks to the part of the PM's role that's about defining the product, not just in the beginning, like ideating on ideas, but also continually being able to iterate and innovate on a future roadmap. Launching a product is just the first step. After it's launched, you have this product out there that you have to maintain and take care of and continue to improve as user needs change, as you decide to change your strategy or vision, and as you decide to grow more users. This next part, bridging engineering and business, I think this is well known, but one of the most important parts of a PM's job is partnering with the engineering team and making sure that the product actually gets built. You'll hear a lot that PMs really need to be technical, or it's really important to have a computer science background. I'll cover this more a little bit later as we talk about how to prepare for the technical interview. But while I don't think it's a requirement to have a computer science background or degree, I think it is important to be able to communicate fluently about technical concepts with your software engineering counterparts if you're working at a software company. Um, and really be a partner to the Eng team. It's really helpful in terms of understanding where the Eng team is getting blocked or has issues. You can help them debug and understand problems. And I think the better you understand your own product, the more effective you can be as a product manager. This last part here about managing a product's full life cycle, to me, references how product managers work not just with the Inch team, but also with all the other cross-functional team members that really contribute to making a product launch successful. And I'll give you an example from my own experience. When we launched Google Pay in Singapore, I partnered very closely with the engineering team, but there were so many others that were also a critical part of our launch. There were the designers who helped us build out the mocks and come up with the look and feel of the app. There was also the marketing team who helped us come up with advertisements, commercials, and promotions to sell the product to users. We also worked really closely with our legal and policy teams, as well as our BD and partnerships teams, who were the ones that actually sought out the partnerships with our banks and made those relationships and that partnership possible. So another question I get often is, what does a PM actually do, and how is it different than all the other roles that are part of building a product? So I thought I'd break it down this way. And the way I think about it is every role answers a different question. As a product manager, the question you're really trying to answer are what problems are worth solving? Whereas your engineering partner might say, how do we build the solution now that we know what we're building? A program manager might ask how, if we're on track to deliver or is everything going according to schedule, versus a technical program manager who might ask, how do we actually solve this problem? So let's actually put this to an example. Let's say we're all building a product and our goal is to grow YouTube users in Brazil. A product manager might worry about why do we need to grow users in Brazil? Is this the right move that will help us meet our goals for the quarter? And if it is the right move, what features do we build in order to actually grow users? An engineer might spend their time thinking about how do we build these features that we brainstormed? Do we have the technologies to build them? How much investment will it take? Is there any technical debt that we need to clean up? A technical program manager might tackle questions like, how do we make sure our app gets released on time? Or do we need to build a new data center to support all this new traffic? Or will our systems be able to handle the load from all these new users that we're going to get? Versus a program manager might spend their time thinking about, is this something that we can deliver this quarter? Is this more of a year-long goal, or is it something that will just take a week for an engineer to spend a bit of time on and just ship? So every role has a place in the building of a product, and it's important to think about what types of questions excite you the most. And I think with some roles, it's very clear what impact you're having and what questions you're trying to tackle. Whereas a PM can sometimes feel like the janitor of a project. You're responsible for making sure nothing falls through the cracks, not necessarily that we're just going to deliver on time, but that someone has thought through every single thing that might go wrong or every single thing that could happen and make sure that there is an answer for all of those questions and that we've really covered ourselves in terms of launching the product. Another question I often get is, what does a day in the life of a PM look like? And oftentimes you'll hear answers like, oh, it changes every day, or no day is ever the same, which is true. No day ever is the same. But I hate vague answers to direct questions like that. So I thought I'd try to be a little bit more specific. As you build out your product, I see this as a sort of a four-phase process. The first is ideation, where you're brainstorming ideas, or you know that you have a problem, but you don't quite know how to solve it yet. In that stage of the product, PMs spend a lot of time doing market analysis. So scoping out the addressable market of users, trying to understand what the competitors are doing, if there is any competitive advantage that you already have with your team, or if you're sort of starting from a disadvantage. This is also the stage where you would do a lot of product design. So working with the UX team to build out mocks for whatever feature you brainstormed, and also working with the engineering team to do a technical design. So, maybe the first idea that you have, you take it to the engineering team and they say, there's no way, this will take us like 2 years to build. Maybe there's some back and forth that happens in order to trim down the initial ideas to something more doable. And most importantly, especially a big company like Google, you have to do a lot of stakeholder approval. So making sure that your directors and your VPs are bought into what you're doing before you start spending a bunch of time from the engineering team and UX team building out a product. And the last step is roadmaps and timelines. So now you have an idea, you built out the mocks, you have gotten the end design approved, and all your VPs are also on board. Now you actually have to ship it. So figuring out how long that will take, if there are any mini milestones you can hit in between instead of doing just one big launch a year from now, those are all things that need to happen in the ideation stage. After you've thought through your product, everyone's on board, and you have a timeline, it's time to actually start building the product. And I call that the iteration phase. During this time, a lot of prioritization happens. Maybe you started out with a long wish list of things that you wanted to put in your product. And maybe as you start building them, you realize that not all of it's possible, or maybe something unexpectedly became harder, or there was a dependency on another team. And that means you can't finish a feature in the time that you had originally planned. So in this phase, I personally spend a lot of time prioritizing for what the MVP or the very first launch will include. And there's always a trade-off here. You can take longer to launch and add more features, or you can launch sooner with a less compelling product. So it's all about finding a balance between the two options and what's right for the team. There's also a lot of adapting to changes in your original plan. Like I mentioned, there might be external dependencies that are taking a little bit longer than expected. Maybe there are something else more urgent came up for your team, and you need to tackle that first before delivering on your original timeline. So all of these things happen during the iteration phase. This is also when you would start looping in your cross-functional partners. So I would start reaching out to the marketing team, keeping them up to date with what we're building, and start brainstorming how we can sell this to users. Do we want to do a really soft launch and maybe not go so loud with publicity and press? Or do you want to have a really big launch announcement with lots of commercials and promotions? That's the kind of thing that takes planning. So it's important to involve your cross-functional partners early. And the last thing I like to do during the iteration stage is get early user feedback. At Google, all new features and products are tested with other Googlers before they're shipped to users outside Google. We call this dog food, but it's a really useful way for us to get early feedback. And many times we have actually changed our product direction based on feedback from dog fooders. It's not always serious feedback, but maybe a flow that we had come up with, for example, in the Google Pay app. If we built a way for you to add your credit card to the app, but you tried to dog food it and all your users told you, no, this is way too complicated, or I couldn't figure out where to add my card, that's something that you should address before you actually go big. After you've taken in all this feedback, adjusted your timelines, looped in your cross-functional partners, it's actually time to launch. This is often the craziest part of the whole project lifecycle, but a lot of time is spent testing the app. Usually lots of changes are checked in by the engineering team at the last minute. So I spend a lot of time testing the app, making sure every critical journey is covered. And what I refer to a critical journey, it really means like the most important things that a user needs to accomplish in order to get value out of your app. So for example, in Google Pay, a critical journey might be adding your credit card to the app or successfully completing the onboarding flow. These are basically the user journeys that need to work all the time. So we test those hundreds of times. We make sure that everything works as we expect. At Google, we also do a final legal review with our lawyers, and we circle back with the stakeholders that we talk to in the ideation stage. and show them what we built, address any changes, and make sure that everyone is on board. And after you launch, it's time to actually land your product. You PMs spend a lot of time collecting and assessing user feedback, either through in-app surveys or, depending on how big your product is, even in-person interviews. You also need to spend some time modifying your feature roadmap after taking into consideration all the feedback from users and any technical challenges that came up along the way. All the features that you deprioritize for your MVP should still get built. So now is a good time to assess when those can fit into your roadmap. And also maybe brainstorm new features. Maybe users are doing something unexpected in your app or using it in a way that you didn't expect. It's not always a bad thing, but it's important to pause and assess where to go next based on user feedback, your backlog of work, and priorities for the rest of the org. And once you have picked a new feature to work on or a new problem to solve, the whole process starts all over again. So next, we're going to talk about how to prepare for the PM interview. And I'll start by going over how to find a PM role. This is probably the question I get most often when I just talk about my background and my journey from software engineering to product management. And I like to think about it like this. There's an easy path and there's a hard path. I think the easier path is switching roles at your current company. Depending on whether you're at a big or a small company, this process might be super formal like it is at Google, or it might be more ad hoc if you're working at a startup. But in any case, no matter if you work at a big company or a small one, I would suggest first doing a little bit of in-company networking, spending some time with or even shadowing other PMs that you know to understand what the job is like, if there are any things that you didn't expect or that might turn you off from the job or make you even more excited. It's good to know those things up front and really understand the ins and the outs of the role. You can also explore a formal interview or internship process like the one that I went through at Google. Or it could be as simple as spending some time with a PM that you work with, maybe asking them if you can take on a side project or pick up some work that they weren't able to get done. And really the idea is to prove that you can do the PM job well before officially converting over. Like I said, every company might have a different process for this. But I think the easiest way to accomplish this is to do it at your existing company where you already have a network and you already know people, and you might be able to easily pick up a side project. The challenge and the harder path is finding a PM role at a different company. I see this as honestly a bit of a catch-22. There's not always a clear path to becoming a product manager, but no company, I won't say no. Some companies don't want to hire product managers without prior experience, but it's not always clear how to get that prior experience. So while I would recommend trying to make this transition at your current company, there are companies that do hire PMs with no prior experience. So it's just a matter of doing a little bit of homework, maybe networking with PMs at other companies and trying to understand what their requirements are. From my own observations and experiences, there are some companies that have a really strict requirement around PMs being really technical or having a really specific kind of experience. My experience has been that those companies are more strict about the types of PMs that they're willing to interview. So perhaps targeting a smaller company is a better way to go at first. Another question I get a lot is whether it makes the most sense to take a role at a different company with the intent of switching to product management. So for example, let's say you're a software engineer at a startup and you're not able to switch to product at your own company, then what do? You can either look for a PM role at a different company, or you can just change companies and then try to switch after you change companies. And I don't think there's a clear right or wrong answer to each one. Obviously, the more direct path would be just finding a PM role at a different company. But if you're not able to do that, I think making sure that you're working at a company that values employee mobility and maybe even has a formal process for switching to product management could be helpful. But once you are able to get the PM interview, there are typically three things that product managers are assessed on. The first is product design, the second is analytical ability, and the third is technical ability. And I should have put an asterisk on that. Technical ability is not always a requirement, but it is at several companies, including Google. So I did want to spend some time going over that today. In the product design interview, what you're being tested on is whether you can design a product that meets the needs of your target market. And I'll cover this more in detail, but this is a really important part of a product manager's job. So what you're really being tested on is not, did you design the coolest or most creative or most innovative product? It's really about whether you can think through a product question logically, make sure you take into account the needs of your users, and design something reasonable. In the analytical interview, what you're being tested on is whether you can think logically through a vague and undefined problem. These questions test your problem-solving skills, as well as your critical thinking and logic skills. And these questions are vague on purpose. If there was a straightforward answer, it wouldn't be a product question. But what your PMs are often given really vague problems, like the example I gave earlier, grow YouTube users in Brazil. There's no one way to do this. There are several answers. So the biggest thing to remember as you tackle all three of these questions is that there's no one right answer for anything. So it's more important to have a clear thought process and demonstrate your problem-solving ability than it is to focus on getting that one right answer or one right number. And the last thing here is technical ability. Every company is different and has a different requirement, if this is at all a requirement. But as a rule of thumb, I would say it's not a requirement to know how to code. You don't need to take a coding class or any kind of official certification. But really, the reason this is there in the interview is to test whether you as a product manager can speak fluently with engineers about your product. So if you have a background in hardware, I would target hardware PM roles where you can leverage your expertise to be a good product manager. My background was in software, so it made sense that I take a PM role at Google, which is a software company. So let's talk a little bit more about these three types of questions. For the product design question, as I mentioned earlier, you're tested on your ability to take in basic requirements and come up with a reasonable product definition and launch plan. And a couple important things to remember for these type of questions is to, number one, always think of the user. Product managers are meant to be the voice of the user. So making sure that you back up all of your ideas with whether or not a user would like it is always a good rule of thumb and a good sanity check as you're moving through the problem. The next tip is to recognize question patterns and have a way of breaking down each one. So I put two here. For product design questions, my experience has been that they come in two forms. The first is improve feature X of product Y. So maybe it's improve the search feature of Spotify, or maybe it's improve the recommended friends feature in Facebook. Either way, you're looking to make incremental improvements on an existing product. The other type of question is to design a brand new product. So design product X for a specific set of users Y. Maybe it's design a ski resort for the elderly, or design an alarm clock for a blind person. And the set of users isn't always specified. So the number one thing to remember is that it's always okay to ask for clarification. I personally have seen interview questions as vague as design a smart fridge. In that case, the set of users isn't properly defined. So part of your job in this interview is to pick a reasonable set of users. Maybe a smart fridge isn't useful for a college student because it has too many features and it would probably be too expensive for them. And maybe a smart fridge is also not great for an elderly person who just wants something simple. So if there's not enough detail in the question, you should, number one, feel free to ask for clarification. But number two, also don't be afraid to share your own thinking and insight. If you're being asked to design, for example, a beauty product, start thinking about out of all the users who might buy your product, which ones are most likely to buy it or use it, and what can you do to make this even more useful for them? So what I always like to do is come up with a framework for how to understand or how to dissect each type of question and apply that same framework over and over again to make sure that it makes sense. So let's take the design product X for a set of users Y question. The way I would break this down is number one, who are my users? Are they young? Are they old? Is it age not important? Maybe it's about demographic. Are they users in the US? Are they users in Brazil? Or maybe it's more about a stage of life question. Are they college students? Are they people living in cities? Are they people living in the suburbs or even rural areas? So breaking down your user segment into your target market is always the first step. Second, I like to think about where users feel pain or why this is a problem for them. The best products address a user problem. So understanding what about the current experience without your product is broken and how your product can help address it is always the second step. Next, I like to brainstorm features or think of ways to mitigate the places that are painful for users. And next, I always like to back up my product design questions with success metrics. So you've picked a target user, you've designed a product for them, you know what their pain points are, but after you launch your product, how do you measure success? Is it in an app? Typically, it's in terms of daily or monthly users, but you can even get more specific than that. Maybe it's the number of people who have taken a specific action in your app, or maybe it's in terms of dollars in revenue if you're building a product that you're trying to sell. So making sure you think through end to end how you can ideate, design, and launch a product is really important for this question. It's less important there's no one right answer. So no interviewer will say, I'm only looking for this one specific design. This is also a great chance for you to show your creativity as you think about creative products or creative ways to solve problems that users are having. The next type of question is an analytic question. And in this type of question, you're tested on how you break down a vague problem into digestible pieces and reason through each one. So for this type of question, the answer is far less important than the steps you took to get there. It's also important to make reasonable assumptions and know some basic statistics, like how many people are there in the US? What's the population of San Francisco? Or how many mobile phone users are there in the world? So knowing some basic stats, and I would keep in mind the type of company you're interviewing at and making sure that you learn some metrics that are relevant to them is always a good first step. Analytic questions can really run the gamut from anything from a Fermi estimation question to pricing and revenue modeling. So an estimation question might be something like, how many self-driving cars will be on the road in 2050? In order to answer this question, you'll have to make a couple assumptions. Number one, what market are you looking at? Is it the United States? Is it Mexico? Is it India? So picking a market and narrowing down your question, number one, makes it easier for you to think through, but also demonstrates to the interviewer how you like to break down a problem. You'll also need to make some assumptions around users and usage. So be really clear in how you tackle this problem. And the goal is to get to a final answer. How many self-driving cars will be on the road in 2050? You'll need to come up with an answer, but what that actual number isn't as important. A way I like to tackle this question is by breaking down the actual question into a set of discrete characteristics or formulas that you can multiply together. So a really simple example would be how many hot dogs are sold in baseball stadiums in the United States. You can start by taking the number of baseball teams, the number of games per season, the capacity of a stadium, and the number of hot dogs eaten per game, and multiply all those numbers together. It's less important the number you get at the end, but more important how you think through the problem and explain to the interviewer how you would break down this super vague question. The other type of question that you might get is pricing and revenue. So, for example, if Google was selling burrito ads in New York City, how much would you charge? So, same thing here. You're also required to show some initiative and make some assumptions. And if the question is too vague, it's always okay to make some assumptions, but then also ask the interviewer if you're headed in the right track. The best interviews I find are more of a conversation between you and the interviewer. So having a back and forth dialogue is always helpful. And the earlier you let your interviewer know how you're thinking about the problem, they might give you a nudge one way or another if they think you're heading down the wrong track, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. So the two tips on the analytical interview are number one, break down the problem, make reasonable assumptions, and tell the interviewer what you're thinking so that they can nudge you in the right way, but also it helps them follow your thought process as they write feedback. The last type of question is a technical question. And like I mentioned here, you're being tested on whether you can have a detailed, intelligent discussion about the product with your peers. Not all companies have this requirement, but for the companies that do, it's really important to understand the core product of your company. If you're working at a software company, a basic understanding of technical concepts is really important. But if you're working at a hardware company or looking to join a hardware company, knowing a lot about the product that that company builds is probably more important than learning how to code. I would suggest in this case, reaching out to people at your company to understand if, first of all, if there even is a technical requirement, but also how to best prepare for it. Um, I I definitely don't think it's a requirement to learn how to code, but being able to talk about a project and the technical aspects of a project are useful. So, for example, if an engineer came up to you and said, our service isn't working, people aren't able to make a payment on the Google Pay app. If this was a problem and you were a real product manager on the Google Pay app, you would need to understand how the payment's being made, what systems does it touch along the way, so that when you do have to deal with issues like this, you know how to dissect the problem and have an understanding of how it can be fixed. And lastly, I wanted to mention some general interview tips. This doesn't just apply to product manager interviews, but these are tips that I found particularly useful as I was making the change. Number one, don't interview prep by committee. I've seen several people who do like 30 mock interviews with 30 different people, and they end up getting feedback with a lot of cognitive dissonance. Instead, I would suggest finding one or two PMs that you really trust and who you think highly of, and doing several mock interviews with them. The reason I say this is because PM interviews are vague and the answers are always subjective. So if you try to interview by committee, everyone has a slightly different approach to solving the problem. None of them are wrong, but it's very hard to come up with an answer that will, across the board, please every single person. It's better to focus on what your strengths are, being creative, and answering the question in a way that you're comfortable with. So try finding a friendly PM who might be willing to help sit with you and walk you through their process, and do several mock interviews with you to help you improve. Next, I mentioned this already, but there never is a single right answer. So even if you mess up a little bit along the way, as long as your thought process is logical and makes sense, there's no reason you'll get dinged in an interview. And lastly, be creative and remember what you're being evaluated on. So in the product interview, it's really important to show your product creativity and brainstorm a lot of cool features. In the analytic interview, it's really important to show your logical side and how you think through problems. Don't get hung up on the details like, did I estimate the number of users in the United States wrong? That's less important than the process to how you got to your answer. The last section I'll go over is how to become a great PM once you've already gotten the job. I've listed here 3 core competencies of PMs. The first is getting and understanding user feedback. The second is prioritization and planning. And the third is communicating and managing relationships. Every great PM I know is excellent in all three of these things for different reasons. Getting and understanding user feedback is the most important skill for any product manager. You can build a beautiful, complex product and think that you're approaching the problem the right way. But if users aren't using the app in the way you expect, or if they use your app and they're still confused, that means something is not working right and you need to change something. So the best PMs that I know are great at not just getting user feedback, but also understanding. Asking for feedback in a way that's easy for users to understand is just as important as getting that feedback later. So making sure that you're asking users the right questions helps make sure that you get feedback that's useful for your team. And a corollary to this is also being willing to change your product plan and be flexible if users are telling you that something is wrong or something needs to change. So even if you start out with a really clear vision, being open to changes to that vision as you continue to iterate and hear back from users is also super important. The next core competency of a PM is prioritizing and planning. Um, I find personally that this is the hardest skill to master. Whenever you brainstorm or think about features for a new product, it's really easy to come up with a very long wish list of features that would make your product awesome. And they are probably all awesome features, but they can all be in the MVP. And for several different reasons. I think many of you must have heard the term fail fast and fail early. I think that's the most important skill for a PM. Getting your product into hands of users as soon as possible is always better. You start getting feedback earlier. You can start validating your hypotheses of whether this product is the right fit for your market. But in order to do that, you also need to be a ruthless prioritizer. And prioritizing can come in many different forms. It might mean deprioritizing features that you're really attached to. It might mean telling other teams who are depending on you for something that you can't get to their work in time. But it's also important to come up with a clear roadmap and make sure that you stick with it. And that brings me to my third point, which is communicating and managing relationships. Typically, a product manager is the person that everyone goes to if they want to know like how things are going or like what's the latest. But an equally important part of the job is also communicating broadly to all of your stakeholders the status of the project or when things change. Being a good communicator is super important for a product manager. It's not only important to speak with engineers, but also with every other cross-functional stakeholder and make sure that they're continually on board with changes that are being made, that they're kept up to date when things do change, and also that you get their feedback. So maintaining an open and honest dialogue with all of your partners is really important. And the other section on here is managing your relationships. This maybe is less of a problem at a smaller company, but at a big company like Google, there are several teams working on several different problems and they're all really important. So making sure that you maintain a good relationship with not just the people that you work day to day with, but also partner teams or partner stakeholders that you might need help from in the future is a really important skill. And lastly, I wanted to leave you with some tips on how to master the PM role. Number one is focus on learning, not shipping. The best PMs that I know are always learning from their users, and they're less concerned with shipping things and shipping things that are absolutely perfect, and more concerned with learning and making sure that they're continuously shipping products that are better. And that requires being a little bit humble. If users don't like something that you worked really hard on, it's more important to understand what the takeaways are and what went wrong instead of just sticking with your launch plan because that was the plan all along. The next is to invest in relationships with your peers and stakeholders. No product gets built alone. It's always a team effort. And the more that you can keep everyone on board and maintain a cohesive team culture and atmosphere, the better your product experience will be. And this is even harder to do in a world where we're all working from home. But I think it's one of the most valuable skills of a PM. And the last tip to mastering the PM role is to have confidence in your vision. You'll always get questions from either people, other product managers who disagree with you, or stakeholders who may not exactly see eye to eye. But if you don't have confidence in your vision, you won't be able to get your team on board and lead the team with confidence. So even if that means asking a few extra dumb questions while you're still ramping up, or doing a little bit of extra due diligence, I find that if you're not confident in your vision, it's really hard to be an effective product manager. So that's all I had prepared for today. I hope you guys found this useful, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or reach out if there's anything that I can do to help. Thank you. Have a great day.